Greetings, everybody, both present and online. It's lovely to have you all with us for this 25th conference, and thank you for Edda and all the other organizers for making it possible to come together here in Tirana. Right. Yes, my topic is keeping languages alive in the Baltic diaspora in Australia. And although I'm not a native speaker of any of these languages, I do have a couple of qualifications to talk about them. One is that I teach them in, especially Estonian and Latvian, in London, at University College London. And the other thing is that I grew up in Sydney in the midst of a diaspora community, being my family were just about the only English speakers for miles around, it seemed to me. We were among a Balkan diaspora community, mostly from Macedonia and Croatia and Serbia. And so I do have some experience of watching a diaspora at work. Anyway, to concentrate on the languages of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, those Baltic languages are not endangered now, and maybe they never really were. But at the time, the three Baltic republics were annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940 and overrun and filled with imported labor from Russia. They certainly seemed to be endangered languages, and there was a lot of talk in the refugee community of their languages being in danger of dying out. They seem to be endangered. The displaced persons camps in Germany were where most of them ended up, coming to them by various routes, but usually through Sweden or wherever there was no obstruction by the fighting in the last year of the Second World War. So from 1945 onwards, various displaced persons camps were set up in Germany to process refugees and send them onward to other countries. Australia was among them. Australia's Labor government under Prime Minister Ben Chifley saw an opportunity to fulfill a felt need to bolster the labor force while keeping Australia white. Australia was considered by its government to be underpopulated and therefore under threat. The experience of nearly being invaded by Japan in the Second World War had frightened the Australian population, especially through the media, into believing that there was a yellow peril on our doorstep. And the rise of China as a power was also happening in the late 1940s as well. And so the slogan became populate or perish. Well, where do you get your population from? The DP camps seemed to be an ideal source. And so, although there'd been virtually no Baltic or very little immigration from the Baltic countries before 1947 to Australia, Australia had to get quickly to come to terms with these blonde and blue-eyed people. And so, even though Australia had no diplomatic representation abroad up until 1940, it was all left in the hands of Britain. So Australia had no experience of diplomacy in foreign countries. And as regards the annexation of the Baltic republics under the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Australia just accepted at face value the Soviet propaganda about the willing incorporation into the Soviet Union. So Australia was not very well prepared psychologically to accept refugees from the Baltic countries. Here we see a picture of Arthur Calwell, the Australian Minister of Education, visiting one of the camps in 1947 and talking to a young Lithuanian lady in national dress. There were two conditions for immigration: that people had to serve a 2-year term of indentured employment in Australia, and they had to agree to well, behave themselves really and live under conditions which actually were not very different to what they're experiencing already in the DP camps. 843 people were on the first ship. Slide 3, please. 843 people were on the first ship that sailed to Fremantle in Western Australia late in 1947, after the agreement between Australia and the refugee organizations in Europe. A mixture of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, roughly in proportion to their populations. And they were transshipped there to Melbourne from Fremantle, and you can see that actually happening. There they are arriving in Melbourne on HMAS Canimbla in 1947 and being put onto trains to go to the Bonegilla camp. We have slides 4. Here is a page from the New Australian newspaper, which shows you the places in Australia where migrants went in Australia on arrival. First, they came to Western Australia by ship, and then they were transported to the eastern states, both to Adelaide and to Melbourne, and some to Sydney. And all this to go to the camps, which were increasing in number and size by late 1947. Slide 5, please. Here's the rather formidable sign outside the Commonwealth Immigration Centre, Bonegilla, which was in the north of the state of Victoria. Here, the male and female populations were separated, living in the camps. Males were simply referred to as labourers, and females were referred to as domestics. So everybody was viewed from an employment possible point of view. At the time, large construction projects were being prepared and considered. For example, the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. Can we have slides? Well, let's have slide 7 on that, first of all. Here are some documents from the camps. Here's a typical identity card of a member of a refugee, a young Latvian woman. I know you can't see it very well, but you can see the amount of detail collected about each refugee. Next slide. Here is an entertainment program from Bonegilla camp in July 1949. By 1949, other nationalities than just Baltic refugees were arriving. There were Hungarians, Serbs, Croats, Russians, Ukrainians, and all in this homemade, you can see representatives of all those nations, if you could read it, on the program there. So quite a selection of different nationalities are already entertaining each other. You made your own entertainment in camp. Next slide, please. Now, the female refugees, or known as domestics, by 1948, they're being processed out of the camps and sent off to find jobs. In these particular ones, there's a group of happy, smiling Baltic women leaving the camp to train as nurses, one of the approved occupations that Australia needed. Okay, next slide, please. Here we have the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. The map of both the area it covered and the area it irrigated in northern Victoria, southern New South Wales, in the mountain area there, the Australian Alps. And it was a huge project that went for, I think, 12 years and employed thousands of laborers. And many of the Baltic male population were sent there to work, living in fairly primitive conditions. Let's turn to the individual nationalities now. Next slide, please. Here is the only statistics I'm going to give you on the screen, but it represents Estonians born in Australia. The number of people born in Estonia, starting from 1923, I think it is, there were 997 Estonians in Australia at the time, a trivial number. But then gradually it built up into the thousands. So by 2011, there were actually more than there ever had been before. But of course, we're not speaking of refugees. By 1950, they start. By 1955, they start to become voluntary, or rather, the wave of immigrants from the DP camps had stopped by 1955, and anybody after that was a voluntary immigrant. Right, next slide, please. Here's the first issue of the first Australian Estonian newspaper, Meie Kodu, which is still going today, Our Home. It's a nice ambiguous title because which is our home, Australia or Estonia? It's deliberately a ambiguous title because the news reported in it was both about what was going on back in the Soviet Union as best as they could find out, and about the refugees' new home and what facilities were available to them there. So it was an information sheet as well as a news sheet for Estonians settling in Australia. And that, because there has been a continuous Estonian population in Australia ever since, that newspaper has continued to be issued every week, nowadays mostly online. The education, mother tongue education was considered very important in all three communities, and in the Australian Estonian community, Saturday schools, in fact in all three communities, Saturday schools were the way of transmitting the language to the younger generation. Later on, by about the 1970s, places where there were concentrations of Baltic populations, in this case Estonian populations, had their curricula merged into the state curricula. Obviously, they were not compulsory subjects for non-Estonians, but they became part of the state government's education curriculum for each of the three nations gradually by the 1970s. Turning now to Latvians, the history of Latvians in Australia is slightly different because there had been a community of Latvians, a small one, stemming from the failure of the socialist revolution of 1905 against the Tsar in Russia. And that meant that there were both pro-independence and anti-independence groups, Soviet-minded groups or national-minded groups living in Australia. And they were factional and they fell out with each other. And so it hindered the development of a single Latvian community in Australia for quite a while. And so really they didn't have much more than a consular assistance to seamen originally, and then a library and not much else. But they resolved their differences by about 1950. And by that time, about 16,000 Latvians came to Australia between 1947 and 1951 from the DP camps, from the displaced persons camps. They settled in Adelaide, Melbourne, and Sydney, and they fostered Saturday schools too, and the Sydney Latvian Society organized cultural events. Can we have the next slide, please? Here's a very recent, in fact, the current edition of Ritums, the Journal of the Sydney Latvian Society, which is still going strong. The society is still going strong, and so are its cultural activities, keeping Latvian culture alive in Australia, in the urban centres. Politics, by the way, was intermittently a very important issue, especially in the movement called Captive Nations, the anti-communist movement, which was originating in actually in the USA. the captive nations movement was important in American exile communities, and it became important in Australia too, especially around the early 1970s, because the Labor government of Prime Minister Whitlam in 1974 actually recognized the incorporation of the Baltic countries into the USSR. And that government was thrown out in 1975, and the Liberal Party government quickly reversed the decision and annulled the recognition. So the political campaign against recognition was very strong, as you might imagine, in the exiled communities.
2 minutes, Chris, please.
The descendants of the Cornwall immigrants, if we could call them that, still call themselves Latvian, and by the present day, there are 20,000 people who call themselves Latvian in Australia. As for Lithuanians, the last of the three nations, 10,000 of them arrived between 1947 and 1951. Like the other Baltic refugees, they saw Australia as a temporary home. They would return home when their country was liberated. Well, that took a very long time, right up until 1991. The 2-year labor contract in unskilled or unsuitable work meant that a lot of Lithuanians, especially who were highly qualified back in their homelands, left as soon as they could. Some emigrated to the USA instead. By 1996, there were only 4,222 ethnic Lithuanians registered in Australia. Their journal, which is on the screen now, Mūsu pastoge, our refuge, our haven, they call it, yes, is a Lithuanian weekly since 1949. That's their first issue in 1949, a bit like the Estonian one I just showed you. The Lithuanian press and the Australian Lithuanian community, which was founded in 1950, always emphasized preserving the identity and language of Lithuania. And language has been preserved in the Saturday schools, as with the other nations, which have been integrated into the state curriculum, as I said before. Next slide, please. I want to say a little bit briefly about broadcasting to ethnic communities in Australia. The Special Broadcasting Service, since 1979, the SBS, has been set up to broadcast to all communities on radio in the state capitals of Australia, wherever there are ethnic communities. And on television, the post policy has been slightly different, giving news broadcasts about the world in English and foreign films and foreign language entertainment, which is something you hardly see at all on the ABC or Australian commercial TV channels. It's served a special and unique need, the Special Broadcasting Service. And so each of the three Baltic communities have, since 1979, had an hour a week in their own language, doing the same kind of service that those newspapers I've been showing you originally were set up to do. So let me just conclude. This is a young diaspora compared with some of the diaspora communities you're going to be hearing about in this conference, only about 3 generations old. The expectations of the hosts and the guests were widely different. They wanted, Australia's government wanted labour fodder, whereas the guests were hoping that they were only temporary guests, and for the time being wanted to keep their language and culture alive. So that's a clash of interests there. No concessions were made by Australian government to make the immigrants feel at home. They were made to just be grateful that they had a survival at all. This meant that they had to exist on their own devices, set up their own press and so on, but they'd been given a taste for doing this already in the DP camps. They already had publishing companies in the camps in Germany. They already had their own schools. And so they were primed to continue preserving their cultures in their distant land of Australia. The languages themselves, there's really nothing of linguistic interest to say about the languages themselves. They haven't been widely affected because the norms of the written languages were very carefully adhered to right from the DP camps onwards. I won't say anything here about interference by Aussie English in the Baltic languages as spoken in Australia. That would be a separate study that we won't go into here. But if there are Australian varieties, they aren't stable or standardized, at least in print. The high education standards were instilled in their homeland.
Can you conclude, please, Chris?
Okay, and in the DP camps. So we have here a clash between assimilation and maintenance. On the Australian side, the White Australia policy was reinforced. So Australia got what it wanted out of the deal. And many Baltic people found a reason to stay in Australia and set up prosperous and happy lives. And some did not, but the conditions were tough. I think that's all I need to say. Last slide, please. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.